I was at the dog park the other day getting footage and just creeping on the dog park, really. And it was a sunny Saturday, which is quite a novelty around here in the Pacific Northwest. So I thought I would get some good footage. And in the span of about 15 minutes creeping on the dogs, I watched 3 dog fights that had to be physically separated by the owner. So they went on long enough for people to walk over there and actually fumble their dogs apart. And it made me think that maybe we should talk about dog fights. So let's talk about dog fights. Why do dogs fight? What does it mean? Is it bad? How do you stop your dog from fighting? What do you do if your dog is fighting? Dog fighting in a normal context is just one end of the spectrum of dog behavior, and that end is ritualized aggression, which is a bunch of signals that are loud and fast and hair fly ferocious looking. They're intended to avoid actual conflict, like meaning actual injury to another animal. You see this everywhere, like almost every animal has something to the equivalent of fighting, and generally it is very rare that the fighting interaction tips over into actual harm to one another. That is not the intent. The intent is to show off enough to avoid actually hurting each other in a normal context. I was watching a Mark Beckoff talk, and I will link that in the description, about dog fights and dog aggression, and he said that of their observations, about 2 to 4% of the interactions were actually intended to do one another harm. And I would assume that does not include most aggression and most dog fighting, because they're not intending to do each other harm. And of the 3 dog fights I watched at the dog park that went on for quite a while, maybe 15 to 30 seconds, because it took the owners a while to get over to their dog. They didn't see the fight coming. They had to fumble to get their dogs apart. They weren't great at it. And of those, they all checked over their dog thoroughly to see if they were injured. Of those 3 fights in 15 minutes, none of them resulted in any injury to any dog. And they're all pretty, from what I was watching, standard reasons to have a dog fight. Like, one dog was coming off his playing but was actually trying to hump, and then there was a couple of sort of hot wound up dogs that just got caught in weird interactions with each other, or just didn't really like each other, which seemed pretty obvious to me but was not, of course, as obvious to most of the owners standing around at the dog park. And I would say that's pretty similar from what I have experienced in dog daycare as well, dog daycare is much more structured than this, with the entries and exits being very structured and dogs being given breaks and there being handlers watching them. So most interactions that seem to be going south are stopped basically before a dog gets a swing in. So before anything can happen, the handler's already heading over there to stop it and is catching the dogs. But the times that it becomes an actual fight that somebody has to break up is like once a month. It's really rare. And if you think about how many dogs are in your average daycare, or at least in my daycare, there's like a couple rooms of 20 dogs-ish on a day, then that's a lot of interactions. How many times those dogs are passing each other, or actually touching each other, or playing with each other. And for that to only, now this is with professional supervision, of that to only blossom over into an actual dog fight that has to be interrupted once a month is pretty low rate of actual aggression. Now, dogs do occasionally tell each other off, and we don't usually really interrupt that. And at a dog park, that doesn't usually need to be interrupted as much. But we're talking about like dogs actually fighting enough for you to tell they're fighting and have to go intervene. And the times that we had real injury was super rare, like once every couple months. And if it was, and by injury, a real injury, I mean like a puncture or a scrape. I don't mean dog had to go to the emergency room for usually just a puncture or a scrape. In that case, that's super rare. Like the amount of times that a dog has been really badly injured is very, very rare, like once every 6 months or something like that. And usually it's from a freak accident outside of a fight. So like a dog that just had really weird social skills or no bite inhibition or something like that. Those kind of injuries are not usually from a fight. That's from a weird dog. And we do kind of have to keep in mind here that we do a lot to affect dog behavior by breeding them, creating certain breeds, and breeding towards certain behaviors. So there are some dogs who don't have the normal spectrum of behavior from, like, you know, appeasement, negotiating signals, all the way to ritualized aggression. And that can be because of like badly orchestrated early experience, because of a breed tendency. And usually, I'm going to put a caveat in here by saying, or like a note in here saying that usually breeding a breed tendency to the point where it like overwhelms natural dog behavior is really hard to maintain, and that breed has to be bred very specifically for that. So it's not something you run onto, because you'd like really have to be going for that and keep going for that and keeping your gene pool pretty small and tweaking it a lot, or doing a lot of line or inbreeding, honestly, to keep that behavior if it overrides like a normal canine behavior. So not so much of a thing you need to worry about. But just also do keep in mind that some dogs, some dog breeds, some dogs' early experiences is weird, and the dog is weird and does not exhibit normal dog behavior in the proper context, or doesn't know how to monitor itself or its mouth in the proper way. So from that, you should take that if your dog gets into a fight occasionally, not the end of the world. And in all these, I'll just use the dog park as an example. In all these situations, one of the dogs involved in each of the 3 fights was removed from the dog park after the fight. So like one of the dogs was taken away, and that's may or may not need to be the case. Most of the time that you have an interaction go poorly between a couple dogs, it's either that the dogs don't really like each other, or that you have done a poor job of like interrupting and managing that. But if you're not interrupting and managing that, then you're leaving the dogs to their own devices, and they cannot file a complaint or like call the police or whatever. So their tactic is to cuss each other out or to take swings at each other, which is non-injurious swings at each other, or give each other the finger equivalent, which is a dog fight. So if you're not monitoring the play and saying, hey buddy, I see that dog's bothering you, or I see that you're bothering that dog, and I'm going to interrupt that or structure that so that it works out better for you, then you're leaving it to the dogs. So they're going to have to bring it to a dog fight if they can't end that in another peaceful way. So if they have a dog that's bothering them and they can't end that interaction, the way they're going to end the interaction is a dog fight, or some sort of aggression. So do keep that in mind. If your dog gets into a dog fight, mental note of what happened there. If he just didn't like that dog, the dog was rubbing him the wrong way. Or in some cases, like with the dog park, the dog's just been there for like 2 hours, or he's cranky, or he just isn't feeling it today, he's not feeling good. On that note about structuring an interaction and interrupting it and watching the behavior and assessing sort of on the fly and using that to build an interaction that will not end in a fight is important if you're trying to get dogs to get along. So like if you're introducing dogs that are unfamiliar, or you're trying to build your dog's social skills, if your dog gets to the point where they get actually into a real fight that has to be separated with another dog, the separation makes that kind of challenging to reintroduce those dogs without another fight. So you don't want to let it get to that point if possible. You want to keep it at a low enough point where you could separate those dogs and reintroduce those dogs again without it having ended in a dog fight, and then it's much more likely to end in a dog fight. So if you're trying to get your dog to get along with a dog or dogs, letting it go to the point of a dog fight, not always the best idea, and makes that much harder to do next time. And this is something that's really well known in like the zoo world. There's a lot, when they're introducing animals in a zoo, they pretty much know they have one shot for it to go well. So they do a lot of assessing and having the animals pass each other and look at each other if applicable, and be close to each other and eat close to each other to determine how that's going to go. And then if they feel like it's going to go well, they introduce the animals, and then they kind of have to let things work themselves out, because if it gets to a point where they have to separate them and reintroduce them, the chances of it going well is pretty poor. And it's the same for your dog, so you really do want to try to prevent a dog fight. If your dog does actually end up getting in a fight, I'll put some links in the description here about how to break up a dog fight. But I will say, don't run in there and feel like it's an emergency and the dogs are going to die if you don't get your hands in there, because that's very rarely the case unless a larger dog has like picked up a small dog and is shaking it. If it's two similar sized dogs or whatever, there's not going to usually be any grave injuries from a dog fight. So it's not the most life or death emergency that you put your hands in there. And your hands are going to be with you for your entire 85, 90-year-old life. And your dog's not going to be around that long. And the chances that a dog bite will injure your hand, which is important and you need and could get infected, especially the hand area, is much higher risk than the chances that two furry dogs are gonna, with loose, tough skin, are gonna injure each other to a point where it's anywhere near as severe as it would be to your hand. So do break up a dog fight, but use your body and your legs if at all possible. Don't grab at them. Grabbiness, not a good idea, and usually a waste. It's not so much of an emergency most of the time that you need to put your hands at risk. To summarize, dog fights are usually, most of the time, statistically not as bad as they look. They mean intentionally to look bad to avoid injury. So it's not like life or death emergency situation that your dog doesn't get in a dog fight, or if your dog shows some aggression. Keep that in mind. However, know that you are kind of betting your cards on the fact that this isn't going to turn into a dog fight if you're seeing an interaction, because if it does, you are basically sacrificing that dog's relationship with that dog. Or if you're doing remedial socialization and your dog hasn't been around that many dogs and you're teaching them social skills, you can do some damage in teaching them social skills, in letting them push every interaction over to a dog fight where they're just kind of making enemies and learning that this isn't working and this is frustrating. So do try to avoid an actual dog fight, because it's going to be much harder to reintroduce those dogs or reintroduce your dog to dogs after each dog fight. Again, not the end of the world. Most of the time, not a big deal. A lot of the time, your dog just doesn't like that dog and it's okay not to interact again with that dog. But if what you're trying to do is getting your dog to get along, then best not to push it into a dog fight.